If you haven't already heard about Anchor, it's by far the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it could be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more of the most popular platforms to preview your podcast. You can make money for your podcast with no minimum listenership. And did I mention it's free? It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So stop what you're doing, start recording, and get paid for what you're saying. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Welcome to the UNNI podcast. I'm your host, Bianca McCall, and today our journey begins in the fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada, and it takes us across the globe to connect with heroes in their own rights in the space of suicide prevention to help us reach a cure for suicide. Today to talk shop, I have on the line with me Mr. Andre Wade. Andre, can you please share with the listeners a little bit about your journey, who you are, what you do, and what you're doing in the space of suicide prevention in your community?
Yeah, sure. Would love to. Thank you very much for having me. My name's Andre Wade. I am a native of Las Vegas, though I've lived in LA and DC. Been in human services for 20 years. Got my undergrad at UNLV in psychology and minored in English, and got my grad degree at UNLV as well in public administration, and minored in nonprofit management. And what really got me in this space of human services of wanting to help people was because I grew up experiencing being bullied at school and feeling rejected or being rejected because of, at that time, I would say my perceived sexual orientation, because nobody knew, or people knew before I did, that I would later identify as gay. But that just really set me on the trajectory to want to help people who felt like they didn't have anywhere else to go. And so I tend to be, for the most part, pretty accepting of people, regardless of who they are and their background. And so usually people will see that I have like a really eclectic group of friends, because it's this idea that, like, if you're cool with me, I'm cool with you, and we vibe, like, we can be friends. Like, I don't care about really the other stuff that goes on. And so I've been in LGBTQ advocacy, policy, practice space since about 12 years now. Started off volunteering through the Human Rights Campaign. That started me doing some LGBTQ work when I was working in child welfare, to becoming executive director of our LGBTQ center out here. And now I'm a state director for a LGBTQ civil rights organization called Civil State Equality. And we focused on passing legislation and getting candidates elected, and education and advocacy. And then also I teach gender, race, class, and sexuality at UNLV. And so that's just a little bit of my my journey, and working with young people to prevent suicide or addressing their suicide ideation has always been this feeling that I had to address either directly or indirectly in my work. And lately it's been more from a policy and practice instead of like a direct service level.
Okay. And thank you so much for sharing that piece of your journey. Can you talk about kind of why is the subject of suicide so important to discuss, not only in the space of practice, and actual prevention, but like what you're contributing into the conversation, talking about academia and talking about policies and procedures and that sort of thing?
It's important because we all struggle, regardless of our identity or our socioeconomic status, we struggle, right? We have these moments in our lives where things get really tough. And if we don't have protective capacity, like a network of friends or families to rely on, then we might engage in drinking too much or abusing drugs or sex as a way to address these feelings that we have. And so with people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and all the other identities, then you're sort of compounded because of this rejection that you have felt directly or indirectly from your family or your community or your church at school. And so the Trevor Project has some information. They are a national help. They have a national helpline for young people thinking about suicide. They have a lot of resources, but they have information that says that 1.8 million youth ages 13 to 24 in the U.S. each year consider suicide. And that's a huge number. And so that's why it's important to address, because there's so many young people who are considering it each year.
Sure. Yeah. So you bring up kind of a really important point. I think when we're discussing, LGBTQ plus population and we're discussing suicidality, there's kind of this, of course there's a relationship. Of course there's an importance to talk about suicidality in relationship to the particular culture. However, the point that you bring up, I think sexuality, the relationship between sexuality and suicidality is an intense one, and it can become very toxic, at times. And can you share maybe why you think that is? Why is sexuality, why does it bring up such a risk for experience of suicidality? Whether you identify as, being a part of the LGBTQ plus community or just in general, how we as humans process and deal and experience our sexuality?
That's a great question. And in my world, we kind of differentiate sexual orientation and sexuality. Mm-hmm. And I say that because we all have a sexual orientation and we all have a sexuality. Mm-hmm. And sexual orientation would be like your one's attraction to someone else. So are you attracted to someone who is of the opposite gender, same gender, both, maybe including transgender folks? And whereas your sexuality, we see like the things that you like to do when you're having sex. So regardless of your sexual orientation, maybe you like using toys. Maybe you like having a third partner in the space. And maybe part of your sexuality is you sometimes like to have sex with someone of the same gender, but you yourself don't identify as bisexual or lesbian or gay. And so there's all these nuances in our sexuality or our sexual orientation. But the notion of sexual orientation is a relatively new thing as it relates to our identity. And so since the beginning of time, we've had the behavior of heterosexuality and homosexuality as this thing. And depending on where you sort of plop down in history, we'll kind of get a sense of what people thought about sex. And so there was a time when in the Victorian era where sex was seen as something you did just for procreation. And in the early era, you weren't supposed to have sex for pleasure. And so if you had sex for pleasure, especially if you were a woman, then, that was the worst thing that could be said of you. But then things slowly transformed to where people started getting pleasure from sex and it was okay. Whereas if you were a woman and you did not get pleasure from sex, you were seen as rigid and frigid and all these things. And some of these terminologies and these tropes still carry on today. And so as we move through to like the early 1900s into the 1920s, where women start to enter socially men's spaces. And so before that, you had where only men congregated together and women congregated together, and there's never really any mixing socially. And so when women started to enter in men's spaces, there was a need for people to identify who were heterosexual men and women and who were homosexual men and women, and who was going to have power as a result. And so this idea of demonizing those who were not engaging in purely heterosexual behavior began because you have to have the stratification of power. And then slowly this idea of one's identity being attached to their sexual behavior began. So you start hearing these terminologies around homosexuality and heterosexuality, and then later the gay, straight, lesbian sort of thing. And so in order to differentiate between who has power, who's the in-group and out-group, we started attaching the fact that gays and lesbians and bisexual folks were being demonized. They were seen as engaging in like lewd acts, like they were bad people. And so that became the thing that carried us into this current day where you have it where people are seen as bad and vile because of their sexual orientation, which is identity basically attached to their identity. But again, it's just a way to see who has power, who's the in group, and being able to determine how are we going to get people to fall into a social order. And so I'll end by saying, like, that's why you have people, and it starts at a young age, like in the schoolyard, when you are seen as different, you start getting bullied because you're outcast. And even if you're someone who might be, a young kid and think that you're gay yourself in this day, if you don't want to be targeted, you just fall in line with everyone else who's doing the bullying because you don't want to be, bullied yourself. And we just see that throughout our everyday lives where parents get really upset and afraid if their kid comes out as gay or trans because they have to try to protect them in this way that they think that they want to have them in this social order, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And kind of what comes to mind as you're speaking is the social order implies that acceptance is power. And we can kind of adapt the phrase that knowledge is power, but really, kind of what you're talking about is within the social order, acceptance is power. And can you maybe talk about what is that process of acceptance? What's more important, or what's the first step in self-acceptance versus, being within this order and being acceptable to society?
Yeah. So there's like, you can reject yourself or be rejected. You can tolerate yourself or be tolerated. And you can accept yourself, and others can accept you. And so most people, I would say, even when they know that they are gay or trans or whatever the identity is, and I use sort of gay as a way of just saying queer or any other sort of identities, not to leave anyone out. But there's this sense of like, oh man, like, why me? I don't want to be different. I want to be just like everyone else. And some people will eventually come to terms with their identity to a point where they're out or fully out or a certain level of being out. But some people will continuously reject themselves and have internalized homophobia or transphobia and not like themselves or that part of themselves that they truly are. And so there's an internal and external struggle, and sometimes they're coming at you at the same speed, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily match up, where meaning that you might sort of reject yourself, where everyone on the outside is kind of like, no, we really, we accept you, we love you. But that in and of itself isn't good enough for someone to eventually come to terms with who they are sometimes. But then just with external people, you can be rejected when you see that your parents are talking bad about gay people and they have no idea about who you are. Or you're sitting in church and the pastor's saying something about your community. But then you might have it to where your parents are like, well, I don't like it, but I'm not going to kick you out, but don't bring anyone here. Don't talk about it around the table. So they're putting up with it, but they don't like it. And then there's that little sense of like full acceptance where it's like, okay, like, it's not what I thought was going to be in store for you as my child, but I accept who you are. I love you. I hope that you meet someone special in your life. And when you do, have them over for Thanksgiving dinner and all these sort of things. And so there's just these different levels. And I think you'll find when people talk to folks who are a same gender couple and they're like raising kids, maybe they're married, that there's probably like this really big story about how they got to this level of acceptance with their family. There's probably a lot of fighting and not talking to each other. So it's like this huge, burdensome journey for a lot of people who identify as LGBTQ+.
Yeah, so you're bringing up kind of acceptance, looking at it not so linear, right? But kind of multidimensional and multifaceted, and there's a distinction between tolerating something and accepting something. Can we talk about kind of what that difference looks like, or what those differences look like in terms of language, in terms of behavior?
For sure. So, I would say something like a tolerance would be where I'll use a friend as an example that, again, like maybe you come out to them and they're just like, it takes them a while to be okay with it. And let's say they are okay with it, but they never want to go to a club or a bar with you. They never want to watch a movie that has a LGBT theme with it. Maybe they don't even want to go to your wedding, but they like you, they love you, but there's these microaggressions or micro rejections that you are getting from them. Whereas acceptance would be that even if they don't necessarily understand what it means to be LGBTQ+, they love you as who you are and accept you and will do and be around you in any sort of space because your identity doesn't matter to them. Again, they may not fully understand. They may ask you questions all the time, but they still accept you. And so we keenly are aware of who we think or know will reject us, tolerate us, and accept us. And I think that's something that our community has to deal with almost every relationship that we have, every interaction. There's this idea that when you come out, but you come out all the time, every day. Because if you meet someone new, at some point you may or may not, quote unquote, out yourself. And it's this constant thing you do, just like being accepted or rejected or being tolerated is constantly changes depending on what room you're entering.
Okay, so you brought up another term in this, and that's understanding, and I even feel like that deserves kind of its own distinction. So we talk about tolerating, acceptance. Where does understanding fall in this dynamic relationship of concepts?
I think that we all want to be understood, regardless of who we are or what we got going on. We just want to be understood as individuals. And sometimes it's maybe intangible, like just understanding what my love language is and that sort of thing. But it might be understood as like, no, I really want you to understand like why I am Black and I don't vote, as an example. And so with something around the LGBTQ community, what we would really love for folks that really love us and have questions to get to that level of understanding is to maybe do a little bit of research or just talking to us or other people so that this other person can get a sense of what it means. So you get a sense of the struggle and the journey. And I'll just speak for Black people. Like, we would love it for other racial minority groups or just racial groups in general to have an understanding of our experience and journey by reading a book, watching some films, talking to folks and have these real conversations instead of having that surface level of just like, oh, you're Black, I don't see I don't see color. It's like, well, that's not really how this works. And it's with the LGBTQ community. When people just say like, oh, I accept you, love is love, and your community is just so strong and beautiful. It's just like, I appreciate the sentiment, but that's not really getting to understanding about who I am and who my community is.
Sure. And will you speak a little bit to how important is it for community and society to be open and willing to reach that level of understanding? How important is that in the process of an individual understanding and accepting themselves or coming to know themselves? Is it necessary?
I think it's at really the core of relationships and core of community, like in a larger sense, because when people feel rejected and outgrouped all the time in different ways, that's when this sense of, well, I don't belong here or with these people. And so what's my alternative? Oh, is it suicide? These other people don't like me and I don't like myself at the
Hey, Andre, I lost you on audio.
Hello?
All right, I got you back.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So the last question that we had was, is it necessary for community, for society to be open, willing to reach this level of understanding? And how important is that in the process of an individual coming into their own, knowing themselves, and having some self-acceptance as well?
I think I know it's really important. It's the foundation of relationships and having a sense of community in the larger sense. So when someone doesn't feel that they belong, that they're not accepted, that they're not liked, sometimes too often people turn to suicide as a way to have the out button. Like, I don't want to deal with this. No one likes me. I don't like myself. So what's my alternative? Suicide. And we don't want people to think about that. We don't want that to be the alternative. What we want is for folks to be accepted, understood, feel a part of their community, be a part of their community, because the alternative is so much worse for everyone.
Yeah, no, I struggle with this idea that it's necessary for community and society to be understanding, to be willing to be a part of this process for each of its individuals. Because let's just kind of be real and talk about the elephant in the room. You've got communities or subcultures within these communities that just are outright refusing to adopt that way of thinking, very rigid in some of the archaic beliefs that you talked about in terms of just sexual evolution. You've got communities that aren't going to participate. And so what does that mean for our individuals that are that are on their own independent journeys. What does that mean? What types of supports do we need to have in place so that individuals can grow and grow into who they are, understand who they are as beautiful creations and individuals, right? But how do we support them when communities may not be willing to?
It will take leaders, folks on the ground, family members, folks like yourself doing this work to have conversations on an ongoing basis with everyday, regular folk, so people can get a better sense of what it means to be LGBTQ plus. And so people can wrap their minds a little bit around like sexual orientation and sexuality. Like they may not like it, they may not agree, but like they understand. Where when it comes to gender identity and transgender and non-binary, like people's minds like explode. They're just like, what are you talking about? But it's something that if one is willing to learn and talk to other people, you can eventually get to a place of having a certain level of understanding. But a lot of people don't even want to go that step to even try to understand because maybe they're relying upon what they've been told in church. Well, my pastor says that gay and trans people are sinners, and so I'm not going to try to learn from them or anything. Maybe people feel like, well, my husband doesn't like this community. So even though I accept my child, I'm not going to really have this conversation with my husband because I don't want to have any issues with them. And so there's all these blockers. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be able to get people to realize that I think what they've been told about LGBTQ people and trans people specifically mm-hmm. has just been a lot of mis and disinformation. And it's a hard conversation to have because you really have to start talking in ways that people aren't really comfortable with. Right. If that makes any sense. Just like, having conversation around sexual orientation and the history and the civil rights movement and just lumping all this stuff in together, talking about privilege and oppression. Like sometimes eyes can kind of roll back in their head or glaze over, but that's kind of where all this stuff is coming from. And we just get it taught to us in school and media and through all these other channels, but we just have to somehow find a way to break through all that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I hear you saying is language is very important, in this process, and almost kind of forcing us to unlearn our history, because our history in talking about parallels like sexuality or sexual orientation and identity and suicide. Our history is very dark, right? I mean, when we talk about the history of how we identified, homosexuality, clinically, it's been seen as a deviant behavior, right? And like you mentioned, in early era of sex is for procreation, not for pleasure, and you were a deviant, if experienced or thought otherwise, and so. How do we begin to change language, and what can we do from within the community? I heard you mention there needs to be an emergence of leadership. What does that look like from coming from within the community in order to change this language?
Oh, it's a good point. Good question. I think a lot of it, depending on the group, maybe even regardless of the group, it starts in the church and places of worship, because a lot of people get their information there. Dinner table conversations, which can be awkward and hard, is a good place to happen. When people see characters on TV or in movies that are LGBTQ, being able to talk about them in a way that's not making fun of them or saying disparaging remarks, because you never know if that person next to you they themselves identify as LGBTQ, or if their loved one identifies. And so having the courage to a lot of times call out people or call in people who are saying these negative things. I have friends who, they're loving, they're accepting, and some identify as LGBTQ, some don't, and all that. And every once in a while, we all will say something that's, a little rough around the edges about someone or a different group. And often you have to say like, hey, that wasn't cool, or, oh, that wasn't really funny. And it gets exhausting, but it's a way to signal to people that it's not cool and that hopefully the behavior change will occur. And we just have to kind of have the courage and the ability to do that a little bit more often. Because otherwise, if we just let this stuff keep happening and having people constantly being discriminated against and harassed and bullied, and we don't say anything, then the problem's not going to get solved. And a lot of it has to do with the language that we're using when we're talking to and referring to other people.
Yeah. Well, I think, let's talk about the dual responsibility, in that, because and I'm speaking to the listeners who they're good people. They love, their family member that may identify, as gay or, just in the spectrum of LGBTQ plus, right? And you've got maybe a parent that is feeling protective over their child, feeling like, gosh, I see how society treats and approaches the subject of sexual orientation, and I don't want my child to have to endure that. And so they may find themselves using oppressive language or the language that we're just speaking of. And so, when they introduce their daughter's partner, they say, this is her friend, and kind of, conceal, what that journey looks like for that individual or for their family member. And it doesn't mean that they're bad people, but maybe it's coming from a place of lack of confidence in society or in the community, and wanting to protect someone that you love. So with that being said, how do we empower, those family members or those community members that may not, they may be at the point that we're asking for. They may be at a point of understanding, not necessarily agreement, but understanding and acceptance. But it doesn't come across that way because they're kind of, sheltering, if you will, with their family member. How do you speak to those parents or those people?
Yeah, a lot of parents, caregivers, engage in rejecting behavior out of love. They love their child so much. They want to protect them, want them to be safe. So they tell them to, if they're a boy, don't play with those girl toys. If they're a girl, be more feminine, or don't be a lesbian, don't be trans. All of this rejecting stuff is a lot of times out of love and wanting to protect. There's a woman, Dr. Caitlin Ryan. She's with her study was called the Family Acceptance Project, and that's the name of the project, the Family Acceptance Project, where she looked at parents and caregivers, and through her research saw that the more accepting parents were of their child, regardless of their race or religious background, that the child had more positive outcomes. And the more rejecting they were, the more the child would engage in negative behaviors like suicide ideation attempts, contracting an STD, that sort of thing. And so it's this notion that even though you don't have an understanding of who your child is, that if you engage in rejecting behavior, that it can have negative consequences in the long term. And so a lot of times people don't want to say the wrong thing, so they either won't say anything at all, or they'll say something that's soft. So instead of saying like, oh, like, where's your girlfriend? It'll be like, oh, where's your friend? And they think that they are being sensitive, but it's like their hesitancy to even like have it come out of their mouths really just signals to the person on the other end is like, oh, well, you're really not there yet with being fully accepting. And you may love me, but you don't really accept because you can't even refer to my girlfriend as my girlfriend. But it takes time. And I think that's one thing that sometimes as a LGBTQ plus person, we fail to realize. So when we finally come out, maybe we're 12, 20, 30, 45, whatever it is, however long it's taken us to come out, we've had that time to come to terms with who we are. So when we come out, we expect people to accept us immediately. Mm-hmm. Whereas the acceptance on the other side may take X amount of times for someone, like the parent who is referring to your girlfriend as that friend. Mm-hmm. And so we have to give people time and space. But at the end of the day, how much time and how much space does one need to get to accepting or feeling like they're accepted?
Right. And I even thought, as you were saying, time and space, from the youth perspective, from a young person that's experiencing this, time and space are like foreign concepts, right? To a young person, we're living in the moment. Everything is right now, immediate reinforcement. Even the way that society is structured today, with advancements in technology and all of these mechanisms to make life more convenient, we've really been informed, or misinformed rather, that the time is now. You know, the reinforcement has to be immediate, like you're saying. So within that premise, you know, how do we help our young people to adopt this level of patience as it comes to their relationship with their environment or with their immediate community?
I believe that it's going to take a concerted effort, because there is no roadmap for LGBTQ plus people when it comes to coming out and getting a sense of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. And so that level of giving a caregiver or a loved one space with accepting you just hasn't been part of the conversation. There's been this fight to just be accepted and seen as a whole individual. And so now I think we can start somehow getting into the nuanced conversations of what it means to communicate with others when you're coming out. And this is something that when I worked at the LGBTQ Center here in Southern Nevada, when we were putting together this program called Pivot, woman Holly Reese, we were having this conversation around communication and what it means to communicate as a young person to your parent around your identity and giving that person space. And when we talked about it a few years ago, it was like, yeah, that just makes so much sense that we know this kind of intuitively, but we're not necessarily messaging this out to people in our community that that's also part of the process. Mm-hmm. And so it's just going to take, I think, its own little mini campaign, if you will, that to give people, young people this, or just anyone who comes out, this sense of time is just needed for people on the other end who need to gather their language and their sense of understanding of what it means for them.
Sure. Yeah, I just, when I think of telling a young person, it's going to take time, I think of, let's say a child wanting a candy bar and a parent saying, after dinner, or later, and it's kind of like are we there yet? When, why, how, and a lot of kicking and screaming. And I think that very simple example can be translated to a lot of emotional kicking and screaming, for a young person that's going, at the point in their journey where they are attempting to reach some self-acceptance and coming out. So, I thank you for sharing the resources and some of what, the initiative has been to almost like construct this roadmap, to coming out. And you're right, there's no how-to, in living any lifestyle. But yeah, it's definitely something that's necessary, especially for our young people. With the statistic that you shared earlier, more young people that are thinking about suicide, that are engaging in behaviors that present a risk for suicide. There's got to be kind of a call to action to figure out what language and to wrap our young people with some type of support, to help them navigate through this process.
Yeah, I'll add, when I was working at the National Alliance to End Homelessness as a policy analyst around youth homelessness, LGBTQ youth homelessness, at the time, this is, 10 years ago now, there was a lot of research and literature on young people running away from home. And running away because, in part, it had to do with their sexual orientation or gender identity. And there was alternative research that wasn't being talked about too much as it related to family acceptance and a young person being able to return home, was the sense that young people will leave the house, run away, and will say to like a provider, like a homeless provider, that, I left the house because my parents don't like the fact that I'm bisexual. And the service provider will think, well, those are bad parents over there. And there's no need to try to reunify you with those bad people over there. So for years, there was never this sense of trying to reunify LGBTQ young people with their families. But if you had the conversations with the parents or the caregivers and you asked them, well, why do you think Susie or Johnny left the house? They'd say, oh, they left because they're just such an unruly, ungrateful kid, or because they were having difficulty with the neighbor, or whatever the story was. And we found out that the reasons why people thought that they left or had to leave just didn't match up. And so my point is just that what we think is the case isn't always the case. And so what we think is going on in other people's head around being accepted or not may not necessarily be what's true for the person that we're trying to get acceptance from. And if we're not having these conversations, we're never gonna know. Because I think there's 1,000,000,001 times when something happens and we think, oh, well, they didn't call me back because they don't like me. And then you realize they didn't call you back because they lost their phone. Mm-hmm. And we miscommunicate these things all the time. And it's going to naturally, and it does naturally happen when it comes to feelings of being accepted or rejected. And so unfortunately, if we aren't loved the way we want to be loved or talked to the way we want to be talked to and all this stuff, that we can easily feel rejected when that's not the intent of the person on the other end. But we have to increase our communication skills and styles to better address these misunderstandings that happen all of the time. And sometimes it just happens in a way that involves suicide ideation, unfortunately.
Right. So you mentioned this important point, reunification, reunification with the family system. And And that kind of brings up for me the thought that that needs to occur, I think, in any circumstance and at any point in the lifespan that a person is coming out, coming into their own and identifying, as gay, as a gay person or LGBTQ plus, right? So as soon as that happens, that kind of marks. It's a milestone, or it's a marker to where there needs to be reunification with the family system for that individual to be themselves. It's like their new skin, their new identity, and there needs to be that immediate connection. Or else there's that risk of kind of this. This disconnection and kind of, being isolated, like immediately practicing, that social isolation, that physical isolation that can lead to the experience of suicidality. And so what is something like that, like an ideal reunification with your family system? What does that look like? I mean, I think kind of as a parody, we could say, yeah, there needs to be like coming out parties, for, the same way that in society and some other experiences we do, there's the divorce party, as of recent years, people have done that, or when you talk about, in the religious, realm, you've got baptisms, you've got, all of these things that there's some type of ceremony that represents a reunification once you've been anointed, or once you've been, you've reached actualization. There's a ceremony that precedes, right? And so what does an ideal reunification kind of ceremony look like for someone that's just come out, and how is it different depending upon what age they are when they come out?
I would say that's actually, I never really thought about it like that. And I would have to do the catch-all that it probably depends on the individual. But by and large, I would say it's the ceremony and the drawing of attention to it that historically LGBTQ plus people have not wanted or not seen as something that's necessary. Mm-hmm. And so this community is the community, LGBTQ plus community, has the burden of coming out. No one else does. And there's this sense of having to come out because you are different, and there's all these other things that are attached to your identity and that people feel like they need to know. And we felt that we need to tell people in order to like start our lives. Mm-hmm. So right now, I think the ceremony is the coming out in and of itself. That probably doesn't have to have a lot of pomp and circumstance, but maybe that's the individual's decision. But I think a lot of people would want it to be where there's not a need to come out, where it's not a big deal. Or if you come out to your parents, they're like, oh, okay, well, can you pass the salt kind of thing? I think that's where we would like it more than having a big show about it. Because I think that's kind of this idea of like having to come out gets it to be like where we have a celebrity and we're just like, oh, we just know that they're out. Why don't they just say something already? Why? And it's like, why do you need to know? Like, why does it matter to you so much? Why is there such a question? And the reason why there's such a question is probably the reason why that person may or may not be coming out in the first place, because we made it such a thing. And that's what we're trying to get away from. Like, it's just not a thing anymore.
Okay, so if I'm understanding, reunification with the family system, it needs to occur, but it doesn't need to occur outside of the norm and what we would consider just like this unspoken kind of acceptance, and this unspoken or silent journey or individual journey to understanding, what that means for the family.
Yeah, and for trans people, gender non-binary, when there's I think a bigger shift where there's a change in identity, where the ceremony, like an informal ceremony, if you will, or telling for reunification, is when a family and friends, whatever, start to use the person's pronouns or use the person's name that has more than likely changed, and allowing the person to wear the clothes that they feel most comfortable in. Mm-hmm. Like that in of itself can be ceremonial and hugely and widely important for someone who's trans and non-binary. And so I think that's an important part when it comes to reunifying, because if you reunify and your family accepts you, but there's no attempt to use the pronouns that you go by or the name that you have, that can be upsetting. And the flip side is that we have to give people a chance to get used to using a different pronoun or a different name. And so that's where that time acceptance on the other side comes into play.
Sure. So, this is kind of bringing up questions about how this looks and how is it so different, as we look at the entire lifespan, because, we've talked a little bit about young people, on the spectrum and what that experience of coming out and what that looks like in terms of acceptance. But you've also got, adults who come out later in life after living a much different lifestyle or living one lifestyle that perhaps within that culture, that subculture, being gay is not accepted. And those adults too are faced with, the question of why they've been assumed to have been living a lie. All of their life experiences have come into question, up until the point that they are identifying as being gay. And so, how do we look, later on in the lifespan, and what do we say, or what is that process like for those adults that are coming out later in life? Perhaps they have children of their own, and their children are questioning kind of, why, how? What do we say?
Can you ask the question again?
Sure. So just, based on, these issues that we're discussing, they occur at any point in the lifespan. We've talked about young people and what that experience is like coming out, and kind of what the social barriers and what some of the internal factors are that may lead to suicidality. Now let's take a look later in the lifespan, because we also have adults who come out later in life. They may have lived a much different lifestyle, or a lifestyle that within that culture, they're not accepting of LGBTQ plus community. And so how do we support, those adults that are going through this process much later in life?
Gotcha. I think it's more or less the same. It's this need to feel and be accepted and understood. And it's going to take people to do some legwork to maybe find out what it means to be LGBTQ. Because most cultures, unfortunately, aren't accepting of LGBTQ plus people by and large. There are some cultures where death is a risk factor, and so someone's real-time safety is something that they really have to take into consideration. But other than that, I think it's regardless of someone's age that people are still looking for acceptance. I think it becomes harder for someone to come out if they are older, and especially if they've had kids and been married and these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, it just goes back to acceptance.
Okay. And so as we're kind of talking about this, I get a little bit weary too with grouping all of gay people or LGBTQ plus, when we're talking about the different experiences, even across the lifespan, because I would argue that, depending upon how you identify is going to create this very individualistic experience. Society, for example, it's more acceptable for lesbian women to be together in society, and even more so if lesbian women are, they present as feminine, within that relationship. It gets a little bit uncomfortable when you have kind of these stereotypes of the more masculine woman versus the feminine woman, and then there's calls to questions of what is the intent or what is the desire of the masculine woman? Do they want to be a man? Are they a threat to all masculinity and such? And that's a very different experience than two men that are together, and what's socially acceptable, in that space. And then your age and all of this creates this very individualistic experience, I think, for the community as a whole, but understanding that there are very distinctive kind of parts and roles that we play in society and in the evolution of how we're looking, at the culture as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it spot on. And even though a feminine lesbian may have it a little easier as far as being tolerated, she wouldn't be accepted and she wouldn't be understood, because at some point there'd be people in her lives or in society who are just waiting for her to grow out of this phase. Or if she had, she had a man and had some good sex, then she no longer want to be with a woman. Mm-hmm. And so there's like a certain level of higher tolerance that she might experience, but by any means, like, it's not the acceptance that she'd probably want and desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that just kind of takes us, full circle in talking about the distinction between tolerating versus acceptance versus understanding. And without all three, you still have, I think, just really significant issues in how, how LGBTQ plus community is being viewed, and accepted, acclimated into what we would consider the norm. Can you? Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I would want to pin the fact that bisexual individuals or biromantic individuals and trans individuals have like the least levels of acceptance. They have the highest levels of depression and suicide ideation and completions. By people who identify as bi aren't really accepted by the straight community, because people are just like, just pick, you're being greedy. And they're not accepted in the LGBTQ world, because people are just like, just pick, and you're being greedy. And so there is like this bi erasure, if you will, where people just, by and large, just don't have a understanding of what it means to be bisexual. So these individuals really feel like they have no space, no community, nowhere to go. And so they suffer at much higher rates than other folks.
Sure. Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. And I think that the way that you explained sexual orientation versus sexuality, I think really aids, or adds to that conversation, or lends to that understanding of the bisexual and I love biromantic individual, things that you may like doing during sex. It doesn't, I think it adds to, your process and your purpose of identity, but, sexual orientation being that attraction, like who which gender you may be attracted to is a different discussion, and so yeah, I thank you for sharing that information, but also highlighting that the bisexual, biromantic individuals are at high risk. When we talk about suicidality, and it really comes from just the lack of understanding, I think.
Oh, absolutely, I agree totally.
Andre, can we talk about technology? That's always something that I like to add into these discussions, just because I think the obvious relevance today is that we have been forced to go virtual with just about everything that's essential due to COVID-19. But leading up into this, this has been a movement that has had quite the momentum in recent years. Advancements in technologies, advancements in how we engage, the internet and digital media in order to, search for facts, in order to have the sense of belonging, in order to reach a point of acceptance, either for ourselves or within society. Can you speak to how what the relationship is between what we're seeing in terms of technology, internet media, with the evolution of LGBTQ plus, as a cultural identification?
Yeah, I will go back to this report from the Trevor Project, where from their findings, 98% of LGBTQ plus young people said that a safe space, like online, like a networking site or however, would be very beneficial to them. And so for young people and people in general to have somewhere to go where they can find community, even if it's online, is very important for folks, especially in this COVID environment where if people are feeling isolated and lonely anyway, this quarantine situation compounds that, and it can really affect someone's mental health. So having a place to go online for connections is very, very important.
Agreed. And you said that was coming from something called the Trevor Report?
The Trevor Project.
The Trevor Project? Okay.
Yeah. They are the national organization, have a website and hotline for suicide prevention.
Awesome. Can you share that with our listeners?
Sure. The 1-800 number is 1-866-488-7386.
Very good. Thank you so much. And Andre, will you kind of just take this time to any other resources or initiatives that you're aware of, maybe some of the things that you're working on through Silver State Equality? I'd like to be able to just link the listeners with what's out there, in terms of factual information, safe spaces where they can go to get more information about how to be either a supportive community member or how to navigate, this journey or this process if someone is identifying as LGBTQ plus and in need of supports.
Yeah, for national online resources, I would point people to the Human Rights Campaign. There's the National Black Justice Coalition, primarily targeting the Black or African American community. And then there's some online resources that are geared towards Asian Pacific Islanders, the Latinx community. So doing those searches for online resources and maybe in different languages would be a place I would start. Here in Nevada, we have the LGBTQ Center for Programs and Services in Southern Nevada. There's our center in Reno. Silver State Equality, we're based in Southern Nevada. And we have worked in the past legislative session on a bill SB 284 or SB 97, what we call the Gay Trans Panic Defense Bill, just outlining where someone can use the defense that, well, this person was gay or trans, and that's why I killed them or inflicted harm in them in whatever situation. We passed a bill where folks can't use that as a defense any longer. And we are working on modernizing HIV laws. There's a lot of stigma attached to HIV laws that make it harder for people to feel self and overall acceptance. And that kind of goes back to, if there are a lot of stigmatizing situations and laws, then that makes people not want to be a part of the community in the first place. So we're working on that, and really just getting people to get out and vote and get a better sense of who legislators are. Because even though it's gotten to the point where a lot of people have opted out of politics and being aware of what's going on in Carson City or in Washington, D.C. or their state capital, these are people that are making decisions about our everyday lived lives. So when we get up and we are upset because the cost of gas is too high, or the insurance on my car, or registration where I don't have a car and I can't get, or bus routes, how much food costs, all these sort of things that are part of our everyday lives are being decided in the realm of politics. And if you're part of the LGBTQ community, it's largely this space where people have made it difficult through laws for people to be out at work in some states, or be out to their landlord in some states. And so we're just really trying really hard to have equality across the board for people's everyday lived lives, so they can have a sense of normalcy and acceptance, whereas otherwise they wouldn't.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing all those resources. And I'll kind of just piggyback or have you piggyback on that and ask you, if there's someone who identifies as LGBTQ plus that's listening right now, and they may be struggling in this moment, or have struggled with thoughts of suicide, because of constant, continuously being misunderstood, or a lack of acceptance either with self or in society. What will you say to that person, in this moment?
I always tell people that we all struggle with being accepted in our identity, and having a sense of positive well-being is something that we all are striving for, but we are literally not alone. And it takes a lot of legwork to find and create your own community and have friends that are accepting. And sometimes you just have to remove people who are toxic from your life to feel better. And this is a journey. And right now, things may be awful, but with a lot of work and the desire to make things better, eventually things can get better. There are tons of resources out there and people who want to help folks. And I think finding out who you trust and who will accept you should be the goal all day, every day for the rest of your life, to where you know that you have a sense of community. And it doesn't have to be 50, 25 people in your life. It could just be really 2 or 3 really strong people. But there's always somewhere to go when you are in need.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And Andre, how would somebody get in contact with you if they wanted to connect, either professionally or maybe just pick your brain about some things? How did we get in touch with you?
Yeah, I am on Facebook, Twitter. It's ANDREOID_nation. So Android Nation on Twitter. I think in Instagram is Android_in Vegas. But nonetheless, through Silver State Equality, you can go to silverstateequality.org and reach out to me there.
Awesome. All right. And thank you so much, Andre, for spending the time to talk with me about these very important issues today. If we can help one person, if we can reach one person, and be able to educate, empower, and give them kind of that sense of connectivity, to resources, to other folks that have lived experience, along a similar path, we're winning, and you joining in those efforts, it means so much to me, and I'm just extremely grateful, for your time and participation on this project.
No, you're welcome. And I have to applaud you and thank you for creating a space for these conversations and having folks like me talk to you and your listeners about these important issues. So thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, sir. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for your time today. I'm your host, Bianca McCall. Remember, connect, create, be constructive. Help me and the many others doing amazing things in the space of suicide prevention, and reach in to give permission to those in crisis to reach out. Please, I welcome for you to share your thoughts, your feelings, your efforts, or the efforts of others in your communities with me. Please, you can find me on YouTube, on IG, on Facebook, under my agency's name, Desert Rose Counseling Group, or you can find me on LinkedIn under my name, Bianca McCall. We also have a website where we'll be posting our podcasts and updates on information. And until next time, stay safe, be well, be heroes.